And what happened was I think I had a heat stroke. And all I can say is I went out of my body. I went into the spirit world. And the first thing I experienced was going into the tunnel that everybody talks about, the light. There was many, many souls, and I could see outlines of figures going towards the light. The love was just beyond anything that you can put into words.
So they get me on the gurney, and I just kind of casually take my attention up. And when I do that, instantly I'm in space. There was no tunnel, there was no anything. Everything was energy, everything felt like love. The pain, the confusion, the identity stuff was gone. Once I did leave my body and I looked down, there was a lot of things that I came to understand. Like, he's dead, his body's dead, the mind is dead, the ego's dead. And after that kind of series of kind of realizations, it was like, well, then what's left? Like, what am I? You know, and the words flooded in very clearly. It was audible. These words were light, energy, soul, spirit, awareness. It's just a flood of words. They weren't in a line like a mechanical. It was like a bunch of voices just said these words. But it felt like it was me explaining this to myself.
I separate from my body. And I immediately go through this saran wrap kind of veil. It was very thin, but it was something there. As I pop through, I go, oh, I'm dead. Oh, I brought my consciousness with me. Wow, that's pretty cool. Then it was like, oh my God, there's a difference between time and no time. I knew I was in eternity.
I was out of my body, looking down at the whole scene. And up there on the ceiling, it was this feeling of being wrapped in this beautiful blanket of love and acceptance. I just felt absolutely wonderful.
It was just a very natural progression of, I was in this state this second, and the next second I was someplace else. I went from being in a physical form to being in a spiritual form. But I realized at that moment that whoever I am, I always am. And there's no such thing as death. And, you know, my spirit or whoever I was is eternal. And that was probably the first big thing, that realization that came to me as this whole thing unfolded, was that my spirit is here forever. So we're essentially two people. You know, we're in this body, which is nothing more than a costume, over the top of who we are always.
I'd always wondered what I'd look like if I didn't have those anxieties and fears and all that stuff. And I thought, I like this. I'm separated from that. And I like this feeling that I'm not that person. I'm not my fears, my worries, my woes. I'm this person. And boy, I tell you, one of the predominant feelings I had, there were so many, but one, this experience of being catapulted out of my body and being like, whoa, it was very much, I know other people have said this, it's like being awakened from a very intense dream. And I had been alive for 59 years at this point, and it felt very much like I had just been shaken awake. And somebody said, hey, that was a pretty intense dream you had. Went on for a while. And yet the fact is those 59 years felt like literally the blink of an eye. It was like, whoa, none of that was that big a deal. You know, I got into all this drama of, oh, he did this thing and my friends left me and all this. It was like, wasn't that big a deal. And as I was in this experience, floating further and further away from wherever I had been, I felt the presence of spiritual beings with me. And I was in blackness. Several people have said, did you see your body? I did not. I've heard people describe this blackness as velvety soft. And it was, but this blackness in which I was ensconced was actively comforting me. And people talk a lot about feeling the love. The predominant thought I had was the peace. The peace. It was like peace was infused into every every iota of who I am, every bit of who I am was infused with this perfect peace.
Where I actually started to lose my physical body and become just a light. I was just this flickering light in this amazing cosmos. It was like vast. Again, it felt like the sky at nighttime and there are stars everywhere. And I was just a light. And in this space, I didn't feel a body. I didn't feel pain. I didn't know that I was in pain. I just felt so light and beautiful. It was a really beautiful, freeing feeling. And as I flickered around, I started to see these other lights come towards me. So they started out as tiny little stars. As they got closer, they got bigger and bigger and bigger until they were massive lights.
And I was just a glowing orb of light. That's what I appeared to be. I had never felt more alive than when I was that glowing orb of light. I had never felt more aware of what was happening on this planet. In that state, I understood everything. The pain, the confusion, the identity stuff was gone. We are all orbs of light. We're not these bodies. I experienced the orb of light as being perfect, as being not confused, as not being contextualized in a human sense in a way where it's going to cheerlead for one side or the other. It was disconnected somewhat from the specifics of the human experience. It was just aware. You were in that body. That body's dead. It wasn't like, you were a black activist and you need to go back and hop in that body and get to the fight. No more fighting. That fight stuff was done.
And I began to be drawn upward through the ceiling of the floor that I was on, up into the following floor, and continued up through floors until I was out the whole roof of the hospital and up into the sky at about the level of a small plane, and then was drawn over the city of Anchorage, which was where the hospital was located. And as I'm going over the city of Anchorage and not feeling any resistance to any of my movement, but I'm going faster and faster, I reached the water's edge and a dark tunnel, cave-like opening opened up and I was drawn into it. And once I was inside, I began moving extremely fast and began to notice that the only light I could see, it was all dark around me, was a pinprick of light way off in the distance. And the faster I went, the larger the light was becoming until I finally burst into the light itself. And I was immediately filled with an enormous sense of love, peace, joy, bliss, and all sorts of emotions, and a feeling of being everything was all right, that I was okay, everything was okay.
Yeah, and I can just tell you that the first thing I remember was being in what I would call a black void. I say void because I really didn't see any boundaries, but yet somehow I sensed that this was kind of a holding place. I knew quickly that I was out of my body, and I wasn't afraid at all, actually. There was no fear. It was almost like a very soothing, soft, kind of velvety blackness is the only way I can describe it. It was comforting. And I kind of knew that I would not be here for long. And I thought, well, where am I anyway? And then the thought occurred to me that I was probably dead. And what do all good nurses do when there's something they want to investigate? They do an assessment. And so I actually quickly did the body check. I kind of felt for my arms and my legs and my body and my head. And I was like, okay, no arms, no legs, check, no head. You're definitely out of your body. And I remember being totally fascinated by that, thinking, okay, you really have died. I don't know how this happened, and I really didn't care, actually. I was feeling pretty great, and I still felt like myself. Out of my body, I was just pure awareness.
And you got to realize I was in this ocean that was roiling, you can't imagine the amount of noise that an ocean makes when it's pounding those waves. And so suddenly it's quiet and it's peaceful. I'm not being tumbled and tossed anymore. I'm not cold anymore. I'm comfortable. But there's this pervasive feeling that I'm not alone, that there's something greater there. They teach us about oxygen deprivation. They take us pretty far into the euphoria, but this is way past anything I'd ever experienced. So I'm like curious, what is this? I just was in the most violent episode of my life, and now I'm in this peace and this quiet. And then I saw just this tiny little pinprick of light, and it draws your attention, Suddenly there's this light. And I started looking at it, and it felt like it was coming toward me. I was moving toward it. And as I got closer and closer to the light, I noticed that it was like millions upon millions of fragments of light. And they were all interacting with each other. They were, if you've ever seen a school of sardines or something like that, where they all swim in unison, it's like they have one mind. These fragments of light were like that, but they were infinite. At this point, I'm like, wow, who am I? What am I? Those types of questions. And I looked down and it was like my body was becoming one of these fragments of light.